Mike and Teresa have no idea what they are dealing with when they encounter an old, tiny stone house in the middle of a large forest. They can't find anything about it online, like nobody had ever seen this thing before. And while at first they are just confused by their discovery, when they look inside the house, they also become afraid. Mike and Teresa seem to be completely stumped by what they were seeing. Why was there a tiny stone house at the center of the forest? They slowly and carefully started to approach it. When they were getting closer and closer, they started hearing a strange noise, not in any way native to the forest. They quickly managed to determine that it was coming from inside the stone house. Teresa used a phone to shine some light into the house and figure out what was going on. Mike, you are not going to believe this. Mike saw her expression change as she slowly put her hand into the house, trying to get something out. But what had Teresa just found inside the tiny stone house? What was it even doing her in the first place? And why had nobody found it before? Before we start our story, smash the like button. Make sure to subscribe and hit the notifications bell so you won't miss any new stories. As frequent hikers, there wasn't much that surprised Mike or Teresa anymore. After 15 years of hiking together, they were experienced and confident in both their skills and their ability to manage whatever came their way. After all, they'd encountered some truly unbelievable things in the past and lived to tell the tale. They'd seen everything from homeless camps to wild animals in the most unlikely of places while out in nature. Once, the police had even gotten involved after Mike and Teresa alerted them to suspicious activity. But what they were about to find would easily top their list of strange sights forever. One Saturday afternoon, Mike and Teresa were getting ready for another hike in the preserve by their home. They had a usual routine, and they always used a checklist to make sure they didn't forget anything important. Although they'd hiked through the area many times before, they hadn't yet covered the entire area. They had no idea what was waiting for them inside the forest. This time, they were planning on going deep into the forest, a trip that would take most of the remaining daylight hours. Teresa estimated that they could reach the center of the forest before heading back. While it wasn't exactly exciting to hike in their local preserve, Mike thought it was worth at least an afternoon. They would get far more adventure than they ever bargained for. Their good friend Jonathan was joining them. When they'd mentioned their plans to head to the center of the forest, he'd seemed surprisingly interested in tagging along, even though he wasn't much of an outdoorsman. Mike and Teresa had no reason to doubt his intentions, so they were happy to have him. But there was more to Jonathan than he was letting on. When they arrived at the edge of the forest to meet up with Jonathan, the weather was perfect for late morning. It was overcast without raining, and the lack of sun made it easier for them to avoid overheating as they started on their hike. The only downside was the looming shadow over the forest that made it seem a bit ominous as they continued on into the darkened trees. The hike to the center of the forest wasn't friendly to beginners, but Mike and Teresa had more than enough experience. They watched out for Jonathan, who seemed to struggle with some of the steeper areas. Still, he was obviously determined. It wasn't until the middle of the afternoon that Mike started to notice something was wrong in the forest. They'd barely seen any wildlife all day. Mike felt silly for not noticing it earlier. Normally, the preserve was full of small game like rabbits and squirrels. Even if they didn't see them directly, there was always some noise in the background. But that day, there were only a few birds circling in the sky. The other unusual thing is that none of the trails seemed to match up with their maps. Teresa had one of her own, and when they compared the two, they matched. But the markings and the paths in the actual forest were different. None of them seemed to go to the center of the preserve. Were they lost? Teresa suggested that maybe they weren't allowed to be in that part of the preserve, but neither of them had ever seen signs stating that. They tried to pull up a satellite view on their phones, but there wasn't any service in the more remote regions. Instead, Jonathan chose a trail and mentioned that maybe they'd find something soon. Mike and Teresa followed. Mike and Teresa decided to follow Jonathan and continue going in the same direction as before. As they walked deeper into the trees, Mike couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't adding up. After all those years of hikers traveling the area, why wasn't there a path worn through the grass and undergrowth? Finally, Teresa decided to pause and check their location again. She was able to get a weak signal on their tracker that indicated they were close to the center of the preserve, happy that they'd been heading in the right direction after all. She didn't even stop to think about what they might find when they reached their final destination. When they arrived at the center of the forest, there was a surprising amount of open space, with plenty of light streaming in through the canopy. Jonathan was visibly excited to get there and picked up the pace. But when Mike and Teresa stepped into the light, they realized that there was something else inside the clearing. Mike approached cautiously, wondering what he was seeing off in a shaded part of the field. He took a few steps closer and suddenly fell over. His foot tangled in something. Teresa hurried over to help him remove his boot and get free. When they looked up, Jonathan was gone. As Mike and Teresa searched for Jonathan, they noticed that there was a series of wire that seemed to go around the perimeter of the clearing. They were about shin height and looked like they were designed to make people trip. Feeling uneasy, they decided to follow the wires to see where they led. Up ahead, Mike realized that the structure he'd seen earlier was actually a small stone house. Based on the ivy, it looked like it had been there for decades. But why would anyone bother stringing wires around an abandoned home? Could the wires have been for a different purpose? Mike peered closer at the building. Maybe it wasn't abandoned at all. Suddenly, Jonathan emerged from the other side of the house. Like Mike and Teresa, he'd been trying to figure out what the wires were for. He showed them a part next to the house, where there were even more wires at varying heights. Before they could figure out what to do next, they heard a bizarre noise coming from somewhere nearby. When they leaned closer, it almost sounded like ticking. The clearing made it difficult to find the source, but Teresa traced it to the back of the old house. It was clear that there was something or someone still inside. Mike was reluctant to go any closer in case it was a bomb, but Jonathan and Teresa couldn't resist their curiosity. Teresa found a short window by the ground floor where she could look inside. At first, all she could see was empty space. It was too dark to tell what was on the other side of the room. She took out her flashlight and held it up to the window for a better view. When she got some light into the house, Teresa saw that there was a small box hooked up to the wires. It didn't seem dangerous, and she just had to know why someone had put a device so far out in the middle of nowhere. Jonathan was eager to help her open the tiny window, and she slowly reeled it in by the wires running under the sill. Teresa turned the box over in her hand and almost gasped as she showed it to Mike and Jonathan. There was an antenna mounted on the opposite side, and red lights were blinking urgently. Mike thought it was some kind of alarm designed to trigger whenever anyone entered the clearing. Somebody knew they were there. Teresa felt like they weren't safe. She wanted to get out of the forest immediately. Jonathan and Mike weren't that scared. They felt a lot of adrenaline. They wanted to get to the bottom of this. What could this mean? Why was this house so important to someone to place a device like this in it? They had so many questions. Who knew that they were here? Then Jonathan suddenly spotted something in one of the trees. He did not see what it was at first. He had to get closer. Teresa begged them to leave it alone and just return to where they came from. Why was this so important to Mike and Jonathan? Then Jonathan saw what it was. It was a camera attached to the tree. Now they certainly knew somebody knew they were there, and they could even see them as well. Teresa felt even more unsafe. This couldn't be good. Mike then changed in attitude as well. He didn't like the whole situation. Jonathan, however, wanted to get to the bottom of this. Would this be something he would regret later? This tiny house was certainly important to someone to keep an eye on it. Was there something else inside of it? Jonathan looked, but couldn't find anything. The device was still blinking. They definitely triggered an alarm of some sort. Then it suddenly stopped. Teresa then heard something in the distance. She felt her heart stop for a moment. Who was approaching them? Teresa rushed to Mike and Jonathan. She warned them someone was approaching. The two men were still investigating the tiny house. They couldn't find anything of value. When they heard from Teresa that somebody was approaching, they did not want to stay. They wanted to return later. Then they heard footsteps. Without any hesitation, the group made a run for it. They couldn't risk waiting for someone to approach them. What if they had bad intentions? Jonathan took the device with him. He wanted to find out what it was. They then heard someone shout in the distance. Teresa was now even more afraid. Who was coming after them? The device suddenly started making sound again. Mike shouted to Jonathan to drop it. They could probably track the device. Jonathan was really stubborn. He did not want to get rid of it. Why was this so important to Jonathan that he couldn't leave it behind? Did he have a secret agenda? Suddenly, Teresa tripped over a branch, and Mike went back to help her. Jonathan, however, ran further ahead, ignoring Mike's shouts. He clearly had his own plan. The barking of dogs echoed closer, urging them to escape the forest. Questions swirled in their minds, but their priority was survival. Teresa couldn't shake the feeling they were being watched. When she injured herself and couldn't continue running, she suggested facing whoever was tracking them. Mike hesitated but agreed. The barking grew louder until 2 German shepherds emerged from the shadows. Mike stood protectively in front of Teresa. Before the dogs could act, a man called them off and approached. The stranger introduced himself as Peter, a local forest ranger. He held a tracking device and asked them why they were in the forest. Relieved by his calm demeanor, Mike and Teresa explained they had stumbled upon a tiny house without any bad intentions. Peter revealed the house was under surveillance, and he was searching for a costly tracking device he had left behind. When Mike told him Jonathan had taken it, Peter invited them to his cabin for an explanation. At the cabin, Peter revealed the tiny house was a remnant of a long-closed amusement park. It had become the site of a significant discovery, a rare species he was studying in secret. He had accidentally left the tracking device there during his last visit and was desperate to retrieve it. However, Jonathan was unreachable, ignoring Teresa's calls and heading toward the forest edge. Frustrated with Jonathan's recklessness, they followed Peter to look for him. Near the forest edge, Jonathan finally appeared, unharmed but evasive about the device's location. Peter pressed him, and eventually, Jonathan admitted he thought the device held some treasure or secret, which fueled his actions. Realizing his mistake, he apologized for abandoning his friends and revealed where he had hidden the tracker. That evening, Peter explained his discovery in full detail. The device had been crucial to monitoring the rare species near the tiny house. He feared anyone else discovering it would take credit for his work. Understanding the importance of his find, Mike, Teresa, and Jonathan agreed to leave the matter to Peter. Days later, they saw Peter's discovery featured in the newspaper, with him thanking the group for their help. They were relieved the ordeal had ended positively, and that their unexpected adventure in the forest had not been in vain.